What's the good word, y'all? DKB here. So we recently found out Jeremy Ruckert went on the non-football injury list, and it's not necessarily news or surprising to people that have kind of followed the trends of how the New York Jets have been handling injuries this season, which is slow pacing a lot of people. This isn't going to necessarily prohibit the timeline that we expect for him to be ready in regards to when we do, full-on padded practices during training camp. But it did raise some red flags for people that didn't know. So I figured this would be a good time to dive into a lot of what these injury designations are going to be and kind of what they mean. So as we go throughout the preseason, we're not really shocked by anything. So one of the first things, and by the way, the CBA agreements that were made during COVID times have changed some of what applies here. So, whether I didn't mention it or if it's just corrections, feel free to add in. But for starters, we have one of our more known titles, which is the PUP tag, or AKA physically unable to perform. So this has two functions depending on when it's used: preseason versus regular season. So if we use this during like a training camp time, players can be placed on this list for football related injuries, and there's no penalty to the team whatsoever. And we'll kind of dive into what that can mean in regular season times in a moment. But essentially, teams can move players to the active roster as soon as they're able to participate, and there's no restrictions, right? There's no, we need you to wait 6 weeks, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, whatever the case is. Once you get the good, the green light that they're ready to go ahead and bring them back in. If a player happens to be placed on this list during the regular season, for instance, there is a 6-week minimum hold time, essentially. They're not going to be able to participate in any of the things to get ready. So it's really not something that's useful during the regular season as much unless you know for sure that you're bringing a player back. And so something like this definitely works out for players like a Jameson Williams that just came out in the draft that for a fact you don't want to force out in week 1 right away, but you probably do want to have him get some time in during the regular season, and that buys him a couple extra weeks. Now, at this point, teams have an additional 5 weeks where they can decide whether or not to allow the player to begin practicing. So there is a bit of kind of, leeway to get some conditioning work in and things like that for a team to gauge if they're going to have to physically keep them, on some kind of injury list for the remainder of the season and not play them. And then if the player does not begin practicing essentially within that 5-week period, or they don't get activated to the 53-man roster within 21 days, once they begin actually completing a practice, then they have to remain on the PUP list for the rest of the season, aka they lose out on the entirety of that season. And that's costly for players. I believe there was something I came up on that said that teams aren't required to play a player or pay a player, I should say, if they're out for certain injury tags. I'm not sure if the PUP actually applies on that list or not, because I don't have it here on my notes. But either way, there's a lot of usefulness for it, but definitely more so during preseason. Now, injured reserve. We have two functioning, situations for this as well. Injury reserve, where you're tagging them as a designation for a return, and then there's COVID IR. So the first type essentially are used for players who, of course, get injured during the year. There is 3 players each season that you can use this on, essentially, and then they spend a minimum of 8 weeks on IR. So just like you would see in Madden and things like that, if you use this, expect half the season to automatically be gone. Again, there's an instance you can use for like a Jameson Williams. Jeremy Ruckert's foot injury shouldn't be this severe, so this wouldn't be one that necessarily applies to him unless something changes, because I do believe they said it was plantar fasciitis, and we know that those can be tricky when it comes to the foot injuries. And COVID IR. So the COVID injured reserve essentially is during this whole COVID situation we had the last 2 years for players that were testing positive. And essentially this just means that at the moment that they test negative and they're ready to go, they can return to the team. Now, there's a lot of rules and stuff that were changing in and out of that for people that were receiving the vaccine versus not. So I didn't dive too much into those details. Just know that that's essentially what it means. And then we have some of our more notable ones, of course, that we're going to see through the course of the regular season. Questionable, doubtful, out. These are pretty straightforward. Out is going to mean they're not going to play for that week. Doubtful has changed along with questionable a little bit just in terms of how it's perceived. We don't have probable as a injury designation anymore, which means a lot of those outliers either went to the questionable side or the doubtful side. And there was some data that I seen, some numbers I came across. Didn't matter a whole lot. It boiled down to we see more often that if doubtful is the designation as marked, they're more likely to follow the path of being out for the week. And if they're marked as questionable, they're more likely to play. And I don't remember the numbers for doubtful, but questionable I think was like 75% of the time, something like that. They're more likely to play. So those pretty straightforward. And then a few of the other outstanding ones. We have the non-football injury. This is essentially what Jeremy Ruckert got tagged with. So conditions unrelated to football is where this will apply, or injuries that did not occur during an NFL game or practice. And I'm trying to remember who it was, but there was a guy last season or the season before that got hurt during I want to say it was Mackay, but I don't want to put that out there. But they got hurt during like a bowling event. So this ended up applying to that situation, or it would have. But either way, a player can't remain on this non-football injury list if they participate in a practice or a game during the preseason. So the moment that Jeremy Ruckert is able to, get off the medical table during this off season and get into a practice, he'll need to be removed from this list immediately. Players on this list will still count towards the 90-man roster, so this is best used for players that you know are definitely going to be making the team unless something catastrophic happens, or maybe some kind of freak great opportunity. And so, again, Jeremy Ruckert, he's kind of our case study here. Perfect situation for him. We know our top three guys are going to be locked, so there's no need to worry about, trying to save a roster spot for this guy and he might not make the team. If the player is on this active non-football injury list and they're still injured by the time that final roster cutdowns take place, and I don't remember the date, but, essentially it's going to be somewhere between 2 and 3 weeks before the regular season starts, I believe. They can be placed on the reserve non-football injury list, which is essentially like a side tag for this. And they won't count towards the 53-man roster limit. So there is a sneaky way on the back end for, you to at least save one player and not have to necessarily worry about them counting against you. So again, our two case studies being Jeremy Ruckert and Jameson Williams. Ruckert is great for now. If you think about a player like Jameson Williams, you still want to keep him around, but you don't want his, roster spot being secured to impact somebody else coming in and being able to, provide some experience, some depth, whatever the case is going to be. So Jameson Williams, that is a tag that would work well for him heading into the regular season. And then the other one is the non-football illness injury. This was kind of like a COVID-like injury designation as well. Players on this list, of course, are going to be placed on here for non-football injuries or some kind of illness. Denzel Mims was tagged with this when he got the food poisoning salmon scare. These guys are also going to be ineligible to practice or play in games for the first 6 weeks of the regular season. So this is why Denzel Mims, when he got hit with them, it kept it around, but it definitely took a toll on his ability to adjust to this new scheme, build chemistry with Zach Wilson and things like that as well due to that restriction. After the 6 weeks, a player can begin practicing with their team, but they can't be moved to the active roster until after the team has played its first 8 games. So it's essentially like the injured reserve tag for them. And then when a player starts practicing, there's a 3-week window where essentially the team has to decide, are they going to move them to the active roster or not? If they don't, then again, they remain on this list for the rest of the season done. Only 2 players can get hit with this tag, and then are eligible to return, so it's not like an unlimited number, which is great, keeps things honest. And then NFL teams, this is one of the ones, are not required to play the base salaries for players during these times that they're missing. So, Denzel Mims was able to make it back, great. But if he's stuck on that, if he got hit with that tag for the entire season, then he basically lost out on a year's worth of money, which definitely hurts the pockets of some of these lower tier guys. And then to kind of wrap things up, practice squad is always something I like to try to keep an eye on. It's usually filled, of course, with UDFAs for us, but with the depth that we have at certain places and things, I think this year might be a time when we see more NFL ready, players that are stuck on that list, more so than UDFAs that we're trying to develop off to the side. So practice squad eligibility requirements. Players with less than 1 accrued NFL season, 6 games on the active roster is essentially the cap. Players who have been on an active roster for fewer than 9 regular season games during their only accrued season, looks like, and then players who have earned no more than 2 accrued seasons with any number of games, and players with any number of accrued seasons. It got really weird the further along that I dive into it but the way I essentially understand it is there's a maximum set of games, which it looks like 9 based on the highest number that I've seen, in any given scenario within the course of 1 or 2 regular seasons. So if they played 9 or less, they'd be eligible to get stashed on there. So I'm not even sure off the top of my head who that necessarily applies and fits to outside of some of our normal selections, but it'll be something to keep an eye on for some of these pieces that we might not be able to trade away. But either way, that is the majority, if not all, of these injury designations, what they mean, some of the breakdowns. For the most part, a lot of these make complete sense to me. Once you get into a little bit of the non-football illness ones, and then of course this practice squad stuff, and then the COVID situations, the waters get a little bit murky. But all in all, hopefully it keeps you guys in the loop on what to expect when we see some of these tags come up, so that we don't unnecessarily freak out. Wish I could have kept it shorter, but again, we're talking a lot of contractual language here, trying to simplify. But either way, let me know what your guys' thoughts are, and I will catch you again. Peace.